The gas came at 2 in the morning. 894 metal tubes fired simultaneously into the darkness above the Bovec Valley. The canisters arced through the rain and fog, struck the frozen ground, and split open. Phosgene. 6.5 tons of it. Heavier than air, it pooled in the trenches where the men of the Italian 87th Regiment slept. Some never woke. Others fumbled for gas masks that could not filter this new poison. By dawn, 600 men lay dead in attitudes of sudden collapse. They had not fired a single shot. In 12 hours, the Italian army would lose more ground than it had gained in 29 months of war. 3 months earlier, the men who planned this attack had stood on the heights above this valley, calculating exactly how many would die. When Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary on the 23rd of May 1915, it did so drunk on visions of conquest. The poet Gabriele D'Annunzio captured the national mood when he declared that Italians wanted a greater Italy by conquest, not by purchase, not shamefully, but through blood and glory. The blood would come, the glory would not. Italy's strategic objective was straightforward. Seize the Italian-speaking territories around Trento and Trieste that remained under Habsburg rule. Complete the unification that had begun half a century earlier. March on Vienna if fortune allowed. The instrument of this ambition was the Royal Italian Army, and the man who commanded it was General Luigi Cadorna. Cadorna was 64 years old when the war began. The son of a celebrated general, he had risen through the ranks in peacetime, accumulating honors and authority without ever commanding troops in combat. He was cold, aristocratic, and utterly convinced of his own judgment. He believed that victory came through relentless frontal assault, that the enemy's will could be broken by sheer persistence, and that any failure to advance reflected cowardice or treachery among his own men. The terrain he faced should have taught him otherwise. The Isonzo River runs 60 miles through what is now Slovenia, flanked on both sides by rugged mountains. The Austrians had fortified these heights before Italy even entered the war. Every crossing point was covered by artillery. Every peak bristled with machine guns. To attack here was to climb uphill into prepared defenses, under observation the entire way. Cadorna attacked anyway. On the 23rd of June 1915, he launched the first Battle of the Isonzo. For 14 days, Italian infantry struggled to cross the river and scale the heights beyond. They were beaten back with heavy losses. Cadorna regrouped and attacked again in July, then again in October, then again in November. 4 battles in 6 months. 250,000 Italian casualties. The front line barely moved. The pattern repeated through 1916 and into 1917. The second Battle of the Isonzo, the third, the fourth. Each one followed the same terrible logic. Mass the artillery, send the infantry forward, watch them die on the wire, blame the survivors for insufficient courage, execute the shirkers, attack again. By the autumn of 1917, there had been 11 battles of the Isonzo. Italian casualties approached 1 million. Austro-Hungarian losses exceeded 700,000. The Italians had advanced perhaps 7 miles, less than a third of the way to Trieste. Every yard had been paid for in blood. Cadorna's response to this slaughter was not reflection, but discipline. He dismissed 217 generals during the war, 255 colonels, 355 battalion commanders. Any officer who failed to advance with sufficient aggression was removed. Any soldier who retreated without orders faced death. The Italian army executed more than 750 of its own men during the war, the highest number of any combatant nation. Cadorna authorized these killings personally, and he went further still. In November of 1916, he revived an ancient Roman practice that had not been used in modern warfare: decimation. When a unit broke and ran, 1 man in 10 would be selected by lot and shot in front of his comrades. In July of 1917, the 141st Catanzaro Brigade mutinied. 28 men were executed immediately. 12 of them had been chosen at random, their only crime being present when the lots were drawn. Cadorna called this discipline. His soldiers called it murder. The army that was supposed to be fighting the Austrians learned instead to fear its own commanders. Yet even terror has limits. By the summer of 1917, something remarkable happened. The 11th Battle of the Isonzo, fought in August and September, became Italy's greatest success of the war. Italian forces finally captured the Baincisa Plateau, a commanding height that had resisted every previous assault. For the first time, the Austrian line seemed ready to break. In Vienna, the news landed like a bomb. Emperor Karl, who had inherited the throne less than a year earlier, understood what another Italian offensive would mean. His armies were exhausted. His empire was fracturing along ethnic lines. The Isonzo front had consumed divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere. One more push, and Austria might collapse entirely. Karl did the only thing he could. He wrote to Kaiser Wilhelm and begged for German help. The Germans had never shown much interest in the Italian front. To the high command in Berlin, the real war was being fought in France and Russia. Italy was a sideshow, Austria's problem to manage. But Ludendorff, the German chief of operations, understood that if Austria fell, Germany would face enemies on every side. Reluctantly, he agreed to send troops. In September of 1917, German specialists began arriving on the Isonzo front. Among them was a chemist named Otto Hahn, a future Nobel laureate who had helped develop Germany's poison gas program. Hahn scouted the terrain, tested the winds, and selected the target for a gas attack of unprecedented scale. The quiet Caporetto sector, where a mountain valley funneled down toward the Venetian plain. Lieutenant General Konrad Kraft von Dellmensingen came as well, an expert in mountain warfare who had learned his trade in the Alps. He walked the ridges above the Isonzo and identified the weak points in the Italian line. The attack would come through the valleys, bypassing the fortified peaks. Let the Italians keep their mountains. They would choke on them when the lowlands fell. To command the assault, Berlin sent General Otto von Below, a veteran of the Eastern Front, who had helped destroy Russian armies at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. Below would lead a new formation, the 14th Army, composed of 7 German divisions and 10 Austro-Hungarian divisions. For the first time in the war, German troops would fight in significant numbers on Italian soil. Among the units assigned to Below's army was the Württemberg Mountain Battalion, a specialist formation trained for combat in the most difficult terrain. One of its company commanders was a 26-year-old lieutenant named Erwin Rommel. He had already won the Iron Cross in France and distinguished himself in Romania. He was aggressive, imaginative, and utterly fearless. In the mountains above Caporetto, he would write his name into history. The Germans brought more than troops. They brought new tactics. On the Western Front, offensives had become exercises in mutual slaughter, millions of shells fired to gain a few hundred yards. The Germans had learned that there was another way. Small groups of highly trained soldiers, armed with grenades and light machine guns, could infiltrate enemy lines rather than smashing through them. These stormtroopers would bypass strongpoints, penetrate deep into the rear, and shatter the enemy's command structure before the main assault even began. Combined with Hahn's gas attack and Bruckmüller's hurricane bombardment, a short but overwhelming artillery preparation designed to paralyze rather than destroy, these new methods promised something that had seemed impossible on the Western Front: a genuine breakthrough. On the Italian side, the warnings arrived and were ignored. Deserters from the Austrian lines reported that German troops were massing in the mountains. Aerial reconnaissance spotted unusual activity behind the front. Intelligence officers grew alarmed. None of it mattered. General Luigi Capello commanded the Italian Second Army, the force that would bear the brunt of any attack through the Caporetto sector. Capello was aggressive, ambitious, and contemptuous of defense. He had positioned his troops for offense, not protection. When Cadorna ordered him to prepare defensive lines, he largely ignored the instructions. When reports of German preparations reached his headquarters, he dismissed them as exaggeration. On the 23rd of October 1917, Capello fell ill with a fever that left him bedridden. The Second Army, stretched across 50 miles of front with no reserves and no fallback positions, faced the coming storm without its commander. That night, 15 divisions of German and Austro-Hungarian troops moved into their final positions. The rain was falling, the fog was settling into the valleys. The Italian radio, broadcasting weather reports in the clear, had told them everything they needed to know. Attack weather. The bombardment began at 2 in the morning on the 24th of October. Along a front of nearly 30 miles, German and Austrian artillery opened fire simultaneously. The shells screamed down through the darkness, striking Italian positions that had been carefully mapped in the preceding weeks. Communication trenches, telephone exchanges, artillery batteries, command posts. Within the first hour, the Italian Second Army was blind and deaf, its nervous system severed at 100 points. In the Bovec Valley at the northern end of the attack, the killing was more intimate. 894 gas projectors, buried in a reverse slope invisible to Italian observers, fired their canisters into the gorge below. The phosgene settled into the trenches like a yellow fog. It was heavier than air, pooling in the low places where men sheltered from the shelling. The Italian soldiers of the 87th Regiment reached for their gas masks, but these were older models, designed to filter chlorine. Against decimation, they offered little protection. Some men died in their sleep, others woke choking, clawing at their throats as the gas seared their lungs. A few managed to stumble out of the trenches before collapsing on the frozen ground. By dawn, between 600 and 800 men lay dead. German storm troops who entered the ravine hours later found no resistance at all. Just bodies, sprawled in attitudes of sudden death, some still clutching masks they had never managed to put on. The gas attack at Bovec was the most successful chemical assault of the entire war. It eliminated an entire regiment without a single German casualty. More importantly, it opened the left flank of the Italian line at precisely the moment when the main assault was beginning further south. At 6 in the morning, the bombardment intensified. Over 2,000 gas shells struck Italian artillery positions throughout the sector. The gunners had been trained to wait for orders before firing counter-battery missions. The orders never came. Telephone lines had been cut in the first minutes of the attack. Runners dispatched to headquarters vanished into the chaos. General Pietro Badoglio, commanding the corps at the center of the German thrust, was away from his command post when the assault began. His artillery, more than 700 guns, stood silent throughout the morning. They would be captured without firing a shot. At 8 in the morning, the German infantry emerged from the fog. They came in small groups, moving fast, carrying grenades and light machine guns rather than the rifles and bayonets of traditional assault troops. These were the Stoßtruppen, the stormtroopers, trained to infiltrate rather than overwhelm. They did not stop to reduce Italian strongpoints. They flowed around them, pressing deeper into the rear, leaving the fortified positions to be dealt with by follow-on waves. Their objective was not ground, but chaos. Shatter the enemy's communications, kill his officers, make it impossible for him to organize a defense. The Italian positions had been designed to resist frontal assault. They were not designed for this. Defenders who had expected to fight from prepared trenches found themselves attacked from the flank and rear. Units that tried to hold their ground were bypassed and surrounded. Units that tried to retreat found the roads already blocked by Germans who had somehow gotten behind them. The fog that hung in the valleys concealed the attackers until they were within grenade range. By noon, German forces had advanced 25 kilometers. 25 kilometers in a single morning. The Italian army had gained less than half that distance in 29 months of war. The town of Caporetto fell at 3 in the afternoon. Italian engineers blew the bridge over the Isonzo half an hour later, but it was a meaningless gesture. The Germans were already across in a dozen places. They had captured intact bridges that the defenders had failed to destroy. They had forded the river where no one expected them to cross. The Italian defensive line, such as it was, had simply ceased to exist. At the divisional headquarters in Caporetto, an Italian colonel named Francesco Pisani witnessed the collapse firsthand. The roads, he reported, were almost entirely blocked by a mass of troops, carts, horses, trucks, artillery pieces, mules, and supplies. Officers, cars could not move. Orders could not be transmitted. The various components of his brigade became separated in the chaos, the freezing fog, and the rain. It was not a retreat, it was a dissolution. Meanwhile, on the ridges south of Caporetto, a 26-year-old German lieutenant was writing his own chapter of the battle. Erwin Rommel had led his company of the Württemberg Mountain Battalion into the attack that morning with approximately 150 men. His orders were to support the lead elements in capturing the Kolovrat Ridge, a commanding height that overlooked the Italian rear. Rommel had other ideas. Moving through broken ground under fire from Italian positions on the surrounding peaks, Rommel spotted something the battle plan had not anticipated. A supply trail winding up through the Italian defenses toward the heights above. Rather than attacking frontally as ordered, Rommel led his men along the trail. They climbed through the fog, bypassing the defenders, emerging behind an Italian artillery battery that never knew they were there. The gunners surrendered without a fight. In their mess, hot lunch was still waiting on the tables. Rommel pressed on. His commander, Major Theodor Sprasser, sent orders to pull back and consolidate. Rommel ignored them. The major, he reasoned, must be poorly informed about the situation ahead. The young lieutenant had seen something that the officers at headquarters could not. The Italian defense was not bending, it was breaking. Throughout the afternoon of October 24th and into the following day, Rommel's detachment pushed deeper into the Italian rear. They captured position after position, always attacking from unexpected directions, always keeping the defenders off balance. Italian soldiers who had been told to hold to the last man found themselves surrounded by Germans who seemed to materialize out of the fog. Many surrendered rather than die for ground that was already lost. On the morning of October 26th, Rommel reached the slopes of Mount Matager, the highest peak in the sector. Above him, the Italian Salerno Brigade held the summit, more than 1,500 men in prepared positions. Rommel had perhaps 300 soldiers left after 2 days of continuous combat. The sensible course was to wait for reinforcements. Rommel did not wait. He led his men up the mountain through dead ground invisible to the defenders above. When they emerged onto the flank of the Italian position, the Salerno Brigade was looking the wrong direction, expecting an attack from below. Rommel opened fire. The Italians, believing themselves surrounded, began to waver. Officers tried to rally their men, but something had broken in the army. When the men see this, Rommel later wrote, they start throwing away their rifles. They look as if they hate the war more than the enemy. The Salerno Brigade surrendered. 1,500 men laid down their arms to a force 1/5 their size. As Rommel's men marched their prisoners down the mountain, they encountered another Italian column retreating from the collapsing front. These men surrendered too. Then another column, then another. By the evening of October 27th, Lieutenant Erwin Rommel had captured 9,000 prisoners and 81 artillery pieces. His own casualties over 52 hours of continuous combat amounted to 6 dead and 30 wounded. It was one of the most lopsided victories in the history of modern warfare. For his actions at Caporetto, Rommel was awarded the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. He was the youngest officer to receive the decoration during the war. 23 years later, the tactics he had pioneered in the mountains of Italy would be given a new name, Blitzkrieg. But Rommel's triumph was just one thread in a larger catastrophe. All along the front, the Italian Second Army was disintegrating. Soldiers who had endured 2 years of Cadorna's brutality, who had watched their comrades executed for retreating and decimated for failing, simply stopped fighting. They threw away their weapons and walked toward home, convinced that the war must finally be over. They surrendered to German patrols without resistance. They vanished into the countryside, 300,000 men scattered to the winds. At his headquarters 30 kilometers behind the front, General Cadorna spent the first day of the battle convinced that the German attack was a feint, a diversion to draw Italian reserves away from the real offensive somewhere else. Only as evening fell and the reports of disaster accumulated did he begin to grasp what had happened. By then, it was already too late. The Italian Second Army did not retreat, it evaporated. In the days following the breakthrough, the roads leading west from the Isonzo became rivers of humanity. Soldiers without weapons walked alongside artillery pieces without crews. Horses pulled wagons piled with wounded men and household goods. Civilians fled their villages, carrying whatever they could lift, joining the military columns in a chaos that made command impossible and movement agonizingly slow. Luigi Albertini, editor of the Corriere della Sera, Italy's most influential newspaper, drove to the front on the 30th of October to see the disaster for himself. What he witnessed defied belief. For the most part, he reported, the troops did not fight. When sent forward, they discarded their weapons and returned unarmed. Many soldiers told him that they had been informed the war was over. It was not only permissible, but sensible to head home. Whether this was rumor, misunderstanding, or deliberate deception, no one could say. The effect was the same. An army of hundreds of thousands was walking away from the war. 300,000 men were officially listed as scattered during the battle. It was impossible to determine how many had deserted voluntarily, how many had simply become lost in the confusion, and how many had been captured while trying to find their units. The distinction hardly mattered. The Second Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. General Cadorna, still at his headquarters in Udine, struggled to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe. For 3 days after the initial breakthrough, he insisted that the situation could be stabilized. The army would rally, the line would hold. When General Capello, still bedridden with fever, requested permission to withdraw to the Tagliamento River, Cadorna refused. A retreat of that magnitude would mean abandoning everything the Italian army had fought and died for over 29 months. It was unthinkable. But the enemy was not waiting for Cadorna to accept reality. On the 28th of October, German advance units reached Udine itself. The supreme headquarters of the Italian army, the nerve center from which Cadorna had directed 11 bloody offensives, fell without a fight. Cadorna had already evacuated, retreating another 160 kilometers to Padua. His departure was so hasty that staff officers left classified documents behind. The Tagliamento River, which Capello had begged permission to reach, was now the only hope of establishing a new defensive line. It was a substantial obstacle, wide and fast-flowing, with bridges that could be destroyed to slow the enemy advance. If the army could cross in good order and the engineers could demolish the spans behind them, there might still be a chance to save something from the wreckage. On the 30th of October, 6 days after the battle began, Cadorna finally authorized the retreat to the Tagliamento. 6 days. In that time, the Germans had advanced more than 60 kilometers. Entire Italian corps had been surrounded and forced to surrender. The roads to the river were already choked with refugees and broken units. The crossing became a nightmare. Engineers destroyed bridges prematurely, trapping Italian formations on the wrong side of the river. Other bridges were left intact too long and fell into enemy hands. German and Austrian forces, pressing hard on the heels of the retreat, ambushed Italian columns as they tried to cross. The fighting around the bridgeheads became known as the Battle of Pozzuolo, a series of desperate rearguard actions fought by cavalry and infantry units trying to buy time for their comrades to escape. Some units fought with extraordinary courage. The Genoa Cavalry Regiment charged German machine guns repeatedly to keep a crossing point open. The Novara Lancers held a bridgehead for hours against overwhelming odds. These sacrifices saved thousands of lives, but they could not save the Tagliamento line. On the 2nd of November, Captain Emil Redl led the 4th Battalion of the 4th Bosnian Infantry Regiment across the river at a point the Italians had believed was secure. Once across, the Austrians fanned out and established a bridgehead that could not be dislodged. Other crossings followed. Within days, the tagliamento was no longer a defensive position, but simply another obstacle the retreating army had to put behind it. The human cost extended far beyond the soldiers. 250,000 Italian civilians fled the advancing enemy, joining the military columns on roads that could barely handle the traffic. They had heard stories of German atrocities in Belgium, of villages burned and populations massacred. Whether the stories were true or exaggerated mattered less than the fear they inspired. Families loaded carts with whatever possessions they could carry and joined the exodus west. Behind them, 900,000 civilians remained in territory that would be occupied by the Central Powers for the next year. Another 55,000 would be displaced when the front finally stabilized along the Piave River. In total, more than 1 million people saw their lives upended by 3 weeks of fighting. The Piave was the last natural barrier before Venice. The river runs from the Alps to the Adriatic, wide and swift, overlooked by the heights of Monte Grappa and the Asiago Plateau. If this line fell, Venice would fall. If Venice fell, the Italian war effort might collapse entirely. Britain and France, already stretched thin on the Western Front, could not afford to lose another ally. On the 5th of November, the Prime Ministers of Britain, France, and Italy met at Rapallo to coordinate their response to the disaster. David Lloyd George and Paul Painlevé had one non-negotiable demand. Cadorna must go. The general whose tactics had bled the Italian army white, whose discipline had broken its spirit, whose blindness had permitted the catastrophe at Caporetto, could no longer be trusted with command. As a condition for sending reinforcements, the Allies insisted on new leadership. The Italian government complied. On the 9th of November 1917, Luigi Cadorna was relieved as Chief of Staff. He was reassigned to represent Italy at the Allied Supreme War Council in Versailles, a face-saving exile that removed him from any position of real authority. In his place, King Victor Emmanuel III appointed General Armando Diaz. The same day Cadorna fell, the last Italian units crossed to the western bank of the Piave. The retreat was over. 70 miles of Italian territory had been lost. The gains of 29 months and 11 battles had been surrendered in 3 weeks. 300,000 soldiers were in enemy prison camps. Another 300,000 had scattered into the countryside. The army that remained was exhausted, demoralized, and reduced to perhaps half its former strength. Behind them, the Germans and Austrians had reached the limits of their own endurance. The advance had covered more than 100 kilometers, far beyond what their supply lines could support. Horses that had hauled artillery through the mountains were dying of exhaustion. Soldiers who had subsisted on poor rations for months were now operating on almost nothing. The captured Italian supplies helped, the chocolate and eggs and wine that Rommel's men had celebrated. But there was never enough to sustain an advance of this magnitude. On the heights of Monte Grappa, Italian defenders dug in and refused to yield. The First Battle of Monte Grappa, fought from the 15th of November to the 23rd of December, marked the end of the German offensive. Austrian attacks continued for weeks, but they no longer had the strength to break through. The winter snows came early that year. The front froze in place. Venice was saved. 30 kilometers from the Piave, at its closest point, the city had been preparing for evacuation. Art treasures were crated for removal. Government officials made contingency plans. In the end, none of it was necessary. The line held, but the crisis was far from over. The Italian army that manned the Piave defenses was a shattered instrument. Half its artillery was gone. Its experienced officers had been killed, captured, or scattered. The soldiers who remained had every reason to doubt their commanders and little reason to believe the war could still be won. Everything now depended on what came next. On whether the army could be rebuilt. On whether the men who had survived Caporetto could be persuaded to fight again. On whether the new commander, Armando Diaz, could succeed where Luigi Cadorna had so catastrophically failed. The answer would take a year to deliver. The numbers told a story of annihilation. In 3 weeks of fighting, the Italian army had suffered nearly 700,000 casualties. Between 40 and 50,000 men were killed or wounded. Another 265,000 were taken prisoner. 300,000 more were listed as scattered, a bureaucratic euphemism that covered everything from desertion to death in unmarked graves. The material losses were equally staggering. More than 3,000 artillery pieces had been captured or abandoned, including 700 from Badoglio's corps that never fired a shot, 3,000 machine guns, 2,000 mortars, enough rifles to arm a dozen divisions. The Italians had spent 2 years building an arsenal capable of breaking the Austrian line. Now that arsenal belonged to the enemy. The Central Powers cataloged their captures with the precision of accountants. 10 million ration sets, 6 million tins of fish and meat, 1,309 tons of dried pasta, 645 tons of cheese, 253 tons of coffee, 5 million liters of wine. Rommel had noted with satisfaction how his poorly fed troops feasted on Italian supplies as they advanced. The young lieutenant's observation applied across the entire front. The Austro-German forces had captured enough food to sustain their armies for months. Against this catastrophe, the attackers had suffered perhaps 70,000 casualties of all types. Some estimates placed the figure as low as 20,000. The disparity was almost incomprehensible. This had not been a battle in any conventional sense. It had been a collapse. Cadorna's response to the disaster was characteristic. Even as his army disintegrated around him, he drafted a bulletin blaming his own soldiers for the defeat. "The army is yielding," he wrote, "beaten not by the enemy without, but by the enemy within." He accused entire units of cowardice and surrender without resistance. He implied that socialist agitators and defeatists had sapped the will of the troops. The men who had endured his decimations, his mass executions, his relentless and futile offensives, were now blamed for lacking the courage to die in sufficient numbers. The bulletin provoked outrage even among those inclined to support the war. Prime Minister Paolo Boselli's government fell within days of the defeat. His successor, Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, understood that Cadorna's continued presence was incompatible with any hope of recovery. When the Allied leaders at Rapallo demanded his removal, Orlando readily agreed. Cadorna departed for Versailles on the 9th of November, bitter and unrepentant. He would spend the rest of his life writing memoirs that blamed everyone but himself for the catastrophe. The inquiry commission that examined Caporetto in 1919 condemned him in terms that left no room for rehabilitation. His decimation policy was called a savage measure, which nothing can justify. His tactical dispositions were found to be fundamentally flawed. His failure to prepare defensive positions or train reserves was identified as a primary cause of the defeat. Yet Cadorna would outlive his disgrace. In 1924, Benito Mussolini restored him to the rank of Marshal of Italy, a symbolic rehabilitation that said more about fascism's need for military heroes than about Cadorna's actual record. He died in 1928, still insisting that his soldiers had betrayed him. The word he left behind proved more durable than any monument. Caporetto entered the Italian language as a synonym for catastrophic failure. Mussolini himself used it to mock his political enemies, calling the failed socialist general strike of 1922 the Caporetto of Italian socialism. For decades afterward, the term was deployed to attack the credibility of the liberal state that had led Italy into war. The battle became more than a military defeat. It became a wound in the national psyche that refused to heal. For the 300,000 Italian soldiers in Austrian and German prison camps, the suffering was only beginning. The camp systems of the Central Powers, already strained by years of war, could not accommodate such a sudden influx of prisoners. During the terrible winter of 1917 to 1918, hundreds of men died every day from cold, disease, and starvation. Carlos Salsa, imprisoned at Theresienstadt, later described how inmates concealed the bodies of their dead comrades so that the deceased men's rations would continue to arrive. The living fed on the entitlements of the dead. It was the only way to survive. The Italian government, consumed by the crisis at home, did little to help. Red Cross packages and supplementary rations were not dispatched until November of 1918, when the war was already over. For thousands of prisoners, the relief came too late. Yet even as the camps filled and the dead were counted, something remarkable was happening on the Piave. Armando Diaz was 56 years old when he assumed command of the Italian army. Like Cadorna, he came from a military family. Unlike Cadorna, he had learned that soldiers fight better when they are treated as human beings rather than expendable resources. His first priority was survival. The Piave line had to hold. Diaz reorganized the shattered divisions, consolidated the survivors into functioning units, and positioned his remaining artillery to cover the most vulnerable crossing points. The Monte Grappa Massif, overlooking the northern end of the line, became the anchor of the defense. If Grappa fell, the entire position would unravel. The Austrians tested the line throughout November and December. They were repulsed. The First Battle of Monte Grappa cost both sides heavily, but when the snow finally ended the fighting in late December, the Italians still held the heights. The immediate crisis had passed. Then Diaz began to rebuild. He started with the decimations. There would be no more. The policy that Cadorna had embraced as the foundation of discipline was abolished without fanfare. Soldiers would still face punishment for desertion and cowardice, but they would no longer be executed at random to terrorize their comrades. The army that Diaz commanded would be held together by something other than fear. The reforms extended to every aspect of military life. Rations were increased in quantity and improved in quality. Pay was raised. Frontline rotations were shortened so that men spent less time under fire before being relieved. Annual leave was extended from 15 days to 25, with additional allowances for peasant soldiers who needed to work their land during planting and harvest seasons. Canteens were established near the front lines, selling food and useful goods at discounted prices. Insurance policies were provided to all soldiers, with death benefits paid promptly to families, rather than lost in bureaucratic delays. Emergency relief was made available to soldiers, families facing hardship at home. Most importantly, Diaz created services dedicated to monitoring and improving morale. Officers were assigned to assess the psychological state of the troops, to identify problems before they became crises, and to ensure that commanders understood the needs of the men they led. The soldiers' attitude to the war, one historian wrote, hitherto a vast neglected hinterland, became a bright arena crowded with officers taking notes. By February of 1918, Diaz had reconstituted 20 infantry divisions and more than 30 artillery regiments from the wreckage of Caporetto. The men who filled these formations were the same men who had fled in October. They had not been replaced, they had been restored. The test came in June. Austro-Hungary, hoping to knock Italy out of the war before American reinforcements could shift the balance on the Western Front, launched a massive offensive across the entire Italian front. The Battle of the Piave River raged for 8 days. When it was over, the Austrians had lost 100,000 men and gained nothing. The line held. The reformed Italian army had proven it could fight. 4 months later, on the 24th of October 1918, exactly 1 year after Caporetto began, Diaz launched his own offensive. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto struck the Austro-Hungarian forces at the moment of their greatest weakness. The empire was disintegrating. Hungary had declared independence. Slavic units were refusing to fight for a crown that no longer represented them. The Italian army, rebuilt from catastrophe by a commander who understood that soldiers are not machines, broke through in 3 days. By the end of the first week, 350,000 Austrian prisoners were in Italian hands. On the 3rd of November, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice. The empire that had ruled these lands for centuries ceased to exist. 1 year from the darkest hour to total victory, the same men, a different leader, a different result. On the 4th of November, 1918, Armando Diaz issued the victory bulletin. Bronze copies were cast from captured enemy artillery and mounted in city halls and barracks across Italy. It became one of the founding documents of the modern Italian state. But the shadow of Caporetto never fully lifted. The word itself passed into the language, a shorthand for disaster that Italians still understand today. The ossuaries remain: 100,000 dead at Reggio Emilia, 7,000 at Caporetto, countless more in unmarked graves scattered across the mountains. The Piave flows quietly now, winding through farmland toward the Adriatic. Tourists visit the museum at Caporetto without knowing they walk through a valley where 800 men died choking on gas in the darkness. The ground is healed. The memory endures. Armies break when pushed beyond endurance. They rebuild when led by those who understand that soldiers are not instruments but men. Caporetto taught both lessons. The cost of learning them was measured in blood.